I'm excited to bring in the next speaker on board, ladies and gentlemen. Put your hands together and welcome John Traxler. John is the Professor of Digital Learning in the Institution of Education at the University of Wolverhampton. He is the founding director of International Association of Mobile Learning. His journal papers have been cited over 8,000 times. He has worked on many digital learning projects and missions, mostly in England, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Let's go ahead, put our hands together, and welcome John on board.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak to so many people at once. I'm particularly focused now on the pandemic, digital learning, and specifically our mission to reach the hard to reach. And I'm talking about a piece of research that I and my colleagues did for the UK's government ministry, DFID, the Department for International Development. And they were specifically interested in this issue of how do we reach those people that are hard to reach. One of the important features of this work, and indeed of this presentation, is to understand the methodology, to understand the methods, the systems we used, just because we felt there is a systemic bias that makes it very difficult to understand the hard to reach. They are hard to reach by definition, and understanding them and supporting them is also therefore quite problematic. So we were given a brief, a contract, a remit for this work. And it came into two different parts. One was reviewing and critiquing and analysing digital responses around the world that were being used to support the continuity of education systems. But the other part, and perhaps that's more unusual and more important, is looking at how those digital responses to the impact of COVID-19 might actually be problematic, might actually be further disadvantaging those communities that were already disadvantaged. So we were seeing an enormous variety of digital responses as many education systems across the world changed over to a completely remote digital support and delivery of education. And in some senses, that was straightforward. We could understand how that happened and how that worked. But the second part of our brief was actually, are those responses, is this so-called digital pivot actually problematic? Is it disadvantaging people maybe outside education systems? And the report was intended both for local and national decision makers globally, and actually for those areas of good infrastructure and bad infrastructure. And obviously we needed to be able to not only work academically, but also present our findings in a way that decision makers could hear and understand and could action. It's clearly in our field very easy to come up with many high-minded, abstract, generalized exhortations to do better, to do more. But actually that's sometimes not much help to people on the ground needing to make a decision, an operational decision about where to put resources and what might be the responses they need to make within their area, within their context, within their situation. Our methods, and this is a very superficial overview before I become more critical, was to do a conventional large-scale systematic literature review, to look at the academic literature, to run Delphi sessions, which I can explain a bit more later maybe, but working with groups of experts and expertise around particular topics. So around distance learning or around minorities or around policy making. And in some senses, that was because we were, as it were, reading the literature, reading what the literature said, but we needed input from different areas of expertise to read across the literature, to read between the lines, to get behind what the literature might be saying, to help us add some critical added value, perhaps. And then we also looked for case studies that might have been helpful to give some greater sense of kind of reality or realism from across our networks and our contacts. I should say that actually we were funded by the DFID EdTech Hub. So this was very much around their agenda of EdTech for the Global South, and producing a research base that would support initiatives and policy making. So we had access to their resources, including their networks and contacts. Delving a bit more into our methods, our concern was, well, firstly, that we actually needed to add value, to say something unique, to say something that other people weren't saying. Otherwise, there was very little point in doing what we were doing. And we were conscious that actually, at the time, in the middle of last year, there was an enormous amount of activity gathering data, trying to organize data by, for example, UNESCO and USAID. All of them looking at what was going on, trying to understand it, trying to make recommendations, trying to do survey work. And to some extent, we were concerned that a systematic literature review might only reinforce what could have been an emerging groupthink. It might only have contributed to a kind of echo chamber where everyone was telling each other the same thing. And that was wasteful and duplicated existing efforts. But we were actually also conscious that in looking at the literature and trying to avoid hitting exactly the same resources and hitting the same papers as everyone else, that there was a systemic bias all through the research life cycle and the funding life cycle and the dissemination life cycle, and that we needed somehow to get beyond that. And this, if you like, systemic bias was partly a function of the fact that organizations and individuals probably only report their successes. They don't report their failure. So if we're trying to understand what will work and we only see the successes, we're only getting a very partial account of what's been happening around the world. Also, the literature is probably written by academics more than by activists or practitioners, because as academics, that's our job. Activists and practitioners don't necessarily have the skills or the resources to put stuff out, to report on what happened. And another bias, of course, is the fact that the literature we were working with, and in fact the literature that most other agencies are working with, is in English. So there could be several parallel universes in Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, and French that weren't contributing to our understanding of the global situation. And of course, the reason academics are doing research and the reason academics are reporting and writing and publishing is because that's what they're funded to do. That's what we're paid to do. But then that reflects the preferences of the funders. We're doing what the funders ask us to do, and the funders are in a wider political environment. And so perhaps it's only relatively safe or incremental or reforming projects that get funded, not the transformative or the revolutionary or the out-of-the-box projects. And so you can see a kind of closed loop between the researchers and the funders. That means a lot of things that could be happening don't happen. A lot of the things that fail don't get reported. And if they're not in English, we don't hear about them. And also, actually, I guess if one is working for policymakers, there are, as it were, limits to their attention span or their capacity to take on board complexity. And if you look at the literature of development studies or international development, you often see remarks about unexpected consequences and remarks about multi-causality. And what this often means is that it's actually hard to account for a success. It's hard to account for a failure. We don't know what caused them. And therefore, if we're looking for recommendations that might help other people in other parts of the world, but we can't explain what contributed to a success or what contributed to a failure, that's all very, very difficult. And of course, once we start worrying about the hard to reach, of course, they are hard to reach for funders, they are hard to reach for researchers, and we know less and less about them. And so our understanding of them is much, much weaker than our understanding of the easy to reach. So we thought those were the kind of difficulties that we'd face in our methods, and in fact, probably in many other people's methods. And that was one of our challenges, to say something different from that. One of our findings in trying to understand the projects being reported in the literature was that culture and context are paramount. What really is important is understanding the contextual background, the complexity, and especially those things which are difficult to maybe quantify, which are difficult to capture in surveys and in questionnaires. Those things that we don't ask people about might be the most important things that govern the success or the failure of projects or interventions. You know, if we work with people and communities and cultures that are not like ours, then there are an awful lot of things that are not worth mentioning, but actually could be very, very important. And so in looking for how to transfer or generalize a success or a project, but not knowing what caused its success or its failure, that's quite difficult. But then, as culture is so difficult to generalize or capture anyway, maybe it makes no difference. So our eventual conclusion was it really didn't matter. We just needed to put as much stuff out there as possible. And if it worked in one context, it didn't mean it would work in a different one. If it failed in one culture, it might still work in another culture. So although culture was vitally important, actually the fact that we can never clearly understand culture might in some senses mean we could ignore it. Now that's slightly paradoxical, but that was one of our findings. But more importantly, I suppose, we were concerned that in looking for responses that supported the education system, we were actually probably looking at responses that ignored or impressed or failed all sorts of other peoples and communities outside the education systems. So, for example, nomads and indigenous peoples, pastoral peoples, refugees, marginal languages. Often in many educations, women and girls were overlooked or disadvantaged. And actually in many education systems, everyone leaves the education system by the time they finish primary education. And that's if they're lucky. So if we look at what responses are supporting education systems, what we're looking at is an enormous number of communities and cultures outside those education systems. And I suppose we also felt that if we look at the imperatives coming from the global agencies like the UN and USAID, IDRC, there is often an impetus for scale and sustainability that means that small scale communities are overlooked or are made to consume the resources that weren't really intended for them or weren't really customized for them. Looking on the positive side, what we said was that actually, of course, everyone inside the education system, outside the education system, is accessing social media, Web 2.0, things like Facebook, WeChat, Flickr, YouTube, all of those things people are accessing, and they're accessing on their mobiles. They're accessing in the sense of consuming the content on Facebook or WeChat or Flickr or YouTube, but they're actually also creating it as well. And so what we were saying was that all of these people and communities and cultures, are actually not only consuming ideas, information, images, but they're actually also creating them and sharing them and discussing them. And actually this is them creating their own education, that they are being each other's teachers. They are not just learning, and they're not just learning by passively consuming. They're actually creating and sharing and discussing within their own communities and globally as well. And so we felt that the best response that the international agencies can make is actually to support those activities where communities and cultures and individuals are creating content, are discussing content, are sharing content, because that gives them agency and autonomy. They're creating their own learning rather than having it broadcast to them by outside agencies, outside institutions, outside organizations, or indeed by education systems which they are not within, education systems which maybe they are ignored or excluded from, but actually they're still doing all of this stuff. They're creating their own education. And so therefore, we were advocating that as a way of reaching the hard to reach, or rather letting the hard to reach each other, to recognize their autonomy, their individuality, their diversity, and supporting that. And we recognized there were a variety of pedagogies that would be appropriate for that if there was sufficient skill, expertise, resource, and capacity for working on those pedagogies. I mean, for example, hertagogy, self-directed learning, or learner-generated content, or adapting the idea of gamification, so that people could develop within their own communities, their own digital learning spaces. And so actually, to summarize our work and our conclusions, what we were saying was that education systems, ministries, officials, practitioners, professionals, organizations have responded with a massive switch or pivot to online digital distance learning. And actually, of course, this has been motivated by the need to solve as many educational problems as possible, as quickly as possible, as cost effectively as possible. But actually, of course, those responses, because they're at a large scale, driven by international or national organizations, are likely to overlook those people and communities and cultures which are outside those education systems, those national institutions, and also those national ways of thinking, that people that are not part of the national mainstream but are outside that. And we recognize that the pivot to digital learning has often been largely conservative, because people don't want to take risks in the course of a pandemic, and so they opt for what already works. But unfortunately, what already works is already disadvantaging some communities, and therefore the pivot to digital learning risks making their disadvantage greater, increasing the inequity and the disadvantage. But we're saying that most peoples, cultures, communities have the experience of working with mobiles, with mobile technologies, with personal and community technologies, and with social media. They have the experience, the familiarity, the access, and the agency, the control. They're doing it for themselves. And so we advocate supporting this activity, maybe just nudging it slightly and contributing slightly. And we recognize that there are some innovative digital pedagogies that can be adapted to local values, local traditions, local needs, and local infrastructure. So at that point, sorry, that's my timer. At that point, I'll stop sharing my screen. And I can take any questions. Yeah, I can certainly post the URL, or you can contact me. Maybe contacting me is the easiest way. I'll put my email address in the chat. To some extent, our position actually was that this activity, the processes and the practices whereby people use social media and mobile technologies to, what we're saying, produce their own learning is something that happens anyway. I mean, it may not be the kind of formal institutional learning that happens in schools, universities, and colleges, but it is certainly happening. And actually, as a professional responsibility, we feel we shouldn't ignore that, but what we should be doing is trying to improve it and reinforce it, to maybe to help people get the critical skills to know what is good, good content, good communities, good resources that they could use, and how they could be more critical about what they're finding on the web, or the communities that they found on the web, or what's happening in Facebook. So that was part of our answer, actually, that this is happening anyway. And it's happening in a far greater extent than what's happening with inside the school and the education sector, involving more people for more of their lives. And if we want to produce, if you like, more competent lifelong learners, then we need to work with what's actually happening out there and make people better digital lifelong learners. And I'm not sure, actually, given that many marginal individuals, communities, and cultures are small and not part of a centralized mainstream, that actually I don't think we're actually particularly worried or concerned about issues of centralization, because that might amount to imposing a kind of uniformity on people and suppressing or marginalize their culture, their language, their values. So I think at the moment, the large-scale responses, both to the pandemic and to earlier educational inequality, risks centralizing them. And actually what we're advocating is some kind of tension, some kind of antidote to too much centralization. I mean, I think there's certainly an argument that technology scales and infrastructure scales, but we would argue that pedagogy and culture and community don't scale, and that we're keen to preserve culture and community rather than threaten it with too much centralization, uniformity, too much consistency. And for the people within those communities, but to be the people that make the judgments rather than the people outside those communities, possibly in universities or ministries or agencies, making those decisions on their own behalf. I'm not sure how many other questions there are. I mean, partly we could argue that what we're advocating is part of decolonizing the curriculum, of giving people greater agency or autonomy over the learning that happens within their community, and having a critical attitude to pedagogies and technologies that come from outside their communities, so that they can reach some kind of critical balance between the learning and the pedagogy and the culture and the language from within their community and preserving that, but exploiting what's worthwhile on the internet, worthwhile on social media, and the opportunities, economic and educational, that that represents. So in any argument about centralization and decentralization, giving people the educational tools or the cognitive tools or the critical attitudes to help them make their own decisions about what they choose to adopt and what they choose to ignore. Are there any more questions? Am I answering the questions that people have posed? I can see a remark about a higher risk of unmanageable failures. I'm not sure. I mean, it's for the people being educated, for the learners and their communities to define what they see as a failure. And I'm not sure if our response or our position increases the risk of such failures taking place. I rather think not, because we're arguing for pedagogies and technologies that give people more control over their own lives and the capacity, the increased capacity to determine what they think is a failure and what is a success. Sorry, there's one more message, I think. Slow. Okay, well, I'm glad to have made that contribution. And I recognise to some extent it's attempting to buck the trend and to argue for not scale or cost effectiveness or sustainability, but actually learning that comes from within communities and supports those communities and is appropriate to those communities. So I'll leave you with that and hope to hear from you online at some point. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure having you on our platform. Thank you for coming and sharing insights. I'm sure everybody is delighted to have you on board and to listen to your session. Thank you so much once again.